drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. The full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomis, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode. Henrich, thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you.
You want to start off by just briefly introducing yourself and telling everyone a little bit about who you are?
Sure. I'm Joe Henrich. I'm a professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University. I apply evolutionary theory to think about the human mind and the emergence of the human mind, and I'm particularly interested in how that process led to what we think of as culture and cultural evolution.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of the human mind, but we'll largely talk about some of the changes that happened to human psychology in history that led up to and gave rise to what you call the Western mind, or your book's title is The Weirdest People in the World. And that acronym WEIRD means something in particular. Can you just sort of summarize concisely for everyone, what is weird psychology and the thesis of this book in a nutshell?
Sure. So the key thing to understand is that WEIRD is an acronym or a backronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And it's really a kind of consciousness-raising device that my colleagues Steve Heine and Aaron Orenzaya, two social psychologists at the University of British Columbia, came up with as a way of raising the consciousness of researchers and reminding them that the populations that they study, typically Americans, people from Western societies, at one time this is mostly university students, are unusual when placed in a global perspective, thinking about their psychological attributes. And we wrote this paper back in 2010, which sort of laid out this as a methodological problem or a shortcoming of a lot of research, excuse me, in psychology and related disciplines like economics. And then I spent about the next 10 years after that trying to explain where it was that these global psychological differences that we see in the data were coming from. And that's where the book eventually came in.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it would be good up front just to get your definition of the West. What is the West?
Well, I think one of the main things is that people get hung up on the West and you know, they want to start with a predefined definition as the West. Mm-hmm. What we did is we started with the data. And we were seeing these different patterns of psychology across different societies. They include societies that you would typically call the West, but of course, that gets fuzzy. And as you travel eastward in Europe, it might be unclear. And the United States and New Zealand aren't clearly in the western part of Eurasia. So it ends up being a kind of cultural definition. But what the book does is it lays out a theory of where these patterns come from. And in the process, you get a sense for why these features of psychology tend to concentrate in Europe. But it also allows you to explain variation across Italy, say, or mm-hmm. variation across Europe or across China or in different parts of Africa. Yeah. So the theory is generally applicable, and it gets us away from this, you know, kind of very humanities style, let's define our terms before we have a theory approach.
Yeah, yeah. So you know, when we hear words like the West, I think what you're basically saying is the stuff that we'll unpack is that we can understand psychology in ways that aren't strictly going to map onto that geography. It's not like all of the Western Hemisphere thinks one way and all of the Eastern Hemisphere thinks another way. Even within the geographic West, there are people who are more quote unquote Western than others, such as Southern and Northern Italians and so forth.
Right. So it is the case that there are these global patterns of variation, but once you have a proper theory, you can think about much more micro level patterns of variation and why different countries, say, in what we now think of as Western Europe, might vary.
Mm-hmm. And so before we get into the emergence of weird countries, we need to have some notion of, how cultural evolution works and how humans actually became a cultural species. You say at the beginning of the book, one of the three key aspects of human nature that underlie it is that humans are a cultural species. We differ from primates in other ways. What is a cultural species, and what are the psychological traits that humans have that other apes and animals don't that enable us to be such a species?
Yeah, so the key thing that you want to focus on is our cultural capacities. And what we mean by that is our ability to learn from other members of our social group. So humans, much more than we find in other species, including other primates, is that we come into the world ready to acquire ideas, beliefs, values, motivations, strategies, skills from other members of our social group. And the way our sociality and these learning abilities work is that this process gives rise to a rich cumulative cultural evolution. So one generation learns a few tools and technologies, and they pass it on to the next generation who improves them, sharpens them, adds to them. And this goes on for generation after generation. And this seems to have been the main way that humans adapted to the diverse environments that they came to inhabit as they expanded out of Africa. So, there's 40,000 years ago, there's humans living in the high Arctic, and then in the Australian deserts, and then the islands of Melanesia off the coast of New Guinea. And we seem to have adapted to these different environments in very different ways. And the information that allows us to adapt to these environments is an accumulated product of many generations.
Mm-hmm. And do we have a sense, or is there any kind of consensus around which, when and where we became predominantly cultural learners? Is that thought to be at the time we really started exploding and expanding across the globe, or is it a deeper thing than that in evolutionary
Yeah,
terms?
so there's a debate about that. So I wouldn't say there's consensus. I have made the case that the origins of our cultural capacities are pretty old. So
Mm.
think 2 million years ago, the origins of our genus, so the genus Homo, we begin to get big brain primates who engage in long distance running, seem to be using underground tubers, are doing a lot of hunting, making increasingly sophisticated stone tools. And what we know from studies of non-human primates and other animals, small scale human societies, is that these things look like they were products of cultural evolution. It doesn't mean we were cultural that in the way we are today, but they look like that these animals were relying heavily on bodies of information that they were acquiring from other individuals. So
Mm-hmm.
something like fire, if we were to drop, any group of university students into the forests of Boston, where I am now, they would be hard pressed to be able to start fire and do the kinds of things they needed to do to survive. But yeah, humans were using fire 2 million years ago and increasingly relying on it over that period.
Mm-hmm. So, they may not have been in the same kind of cultures that we have today, or engage in cultural learning to the extent, but this ability was at least well underway quite a while ago.
Right. So we have a long period, and I and others have made the case that what really drove the expansion of our brains was that our brains grew in order to tap into this vast body of knowledge. So once you get that cumulative process I described, you need brains that are capable of acquiring, storing, and organizing this increasing body of non-genetic information.
Mm-hmm.
So our brain expansions may have been to make us better at that process. So it's this gene culture coevolutionary process that may explain our unusually large brains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to dig into this somewhat as we go in, sort of the analogy between the way culture evolves and the way that biology evolves, the coevolution of these things and how they sort of feed back on each other. In terms of what cultural learning is, what it involves, you write in the beginning that cultural learning will tend to dominate our experiences and intuitions in domains that are important but too costly or impossible to explore through personal experience or trial and error. Think religion and ritual. What does that mean?
Well, things like religion and ritual are make claims about the world that it's pretty hard to confirm just based on your own life experience.
Mhm.
Um, So in lots of societies, one of the things I point out in the book is that, rituals seem to have this binding psychological effect on people.
Hmm.
But when you're a young learner learning in that world, you're just seeing the adults doing these rituals, and often they'll be doing them to appease a god or to satisfy the ancestors or something like that. But it turns out that the action of doing that ritual actually binds the group together. And so the ritual has a real functional importance. And the thing that it does, nobody really understands in the group. They think they're helping the god. And how are you supposed to know if the gods exist if you're just, a young hunter-gatherer child trying to make your way in the world, right? Everybody else seems to think the god exists, so press on as if it does, right?
Hmm. Yeah, that brings us to the other two key aspects of human nature that you say underline the book. So one, the second of the three is social norms are assembled into institutions by cultural evolution, and the third is that institutions usually remain inscrutable to those operating within them, like fish and water. And so you just mentioned that we have these rituals, we perform these actions in the world that seem to bind the group together and help it cohere, which is going to have adaptive value by keeping the group together and coordinated. But people often don't really understand the actual function these rituals are performing. They don't necessarily have a theory of how the ritual is leading to group cohesion. They have other types of stories which tend to take the form of religious beliefs. Unpack that a little bit more for us.
Yeah, so I mean, a big thing that I work on is the evolution of religion and ritual, and lots of different. So over the course of human history, the gods seem to have increased in size, which means they're gods of larger numbers of people. They have more power to punish. They're concerned about moral things that occur between strangers, and that seems to have expanded over time. So, one idea is that it was competition among societies that drove this. So, you have different societies that are getting different norms and sets of beliefs, say about different kinds of supernatural agents or how to do rituals. But some of those led to success in this intergroup competition. So those tend to spread and other groups copy them. And so they get more widespread. And over time, this ratchets up the size and changes the nature of rituals to bind groups together. Now, the actors within these institutions don't really understand what's going on. They just know that they don't know, they just follow the norms and rituals, and then their society is more successful or less successful, depending on the details. So that's one idea for how religions of rituals have changed over long periods of time. One of the things I look at in the book is the evolution of marriage systems. So, for example, in Canada and the US now, there's a debate about polygyny. Should men and women be allowed to take additional spouses?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've made the case, and I make the case in the Weirdest People in the World, that the evolution of strictly normative monogamous societies actually had societal level benefits, even though in most societies over human history, elite and high status males were able to take additional wives. So, in some sense, curved what otherwise develops naturally. But then this led to societal level benefits. But people engaging in monogamy and avoiding polygyny don't think, well, I need to do this to stop the creation of this unruly pool of unmarried men with no
Right.
chance of mating our marriage market. They just think that this is right and appropriate and this is how God wants it, or this is,
Yeah.
unfair to other people to not do this way or something like that.
Yeah. In some sense, we're seeing things play out today in terms of how people don't actually recognize why certain norms are in place
Right.
and
So
what their
that,
societal
yeah.
level impacts are. So let's just define explicitly for people so they can follow along. What are social norms and institutions, and why is there a tendency to see this coalescence of norms and behaviors into institutions? Does that have something to do with information transmission and evolvability?
Yeah, so in the way I approach all this, we need to explain things that people like sociologists and others take for granted, anthropologists as well. So, social norms are cases where you can learn both the behavior, say a food taboo, don't eat pigs, and a rule for judging others, judging norm violators. So, what do you think about pig eaters? So, if you're a non-pig eater, what do you think about pig eaters? And it becomes a social norm when most people in the group are doing it and they have negative reactions to people doing it a different way. And that'll lock up the group on a social norm. So once you're a sufficiently good cultural learner, these things are just going to pop up because you can learn both the standards for judging others and the behavior. And if you get the right combination of those, you'll get a proliferation of all kinds of different social norms. So that you get just as a product of being sufficiently cultural.
Hmm.
Now, here I just want to call an institution a set of interconnected norms. So one simple example that we know is ancient is marriage systems. People have all kinds of rules about who can marry, when they can marry, and then the rules guiding, the exchange between the families and what are the various roles of the people involved in the marriage and whatnot. So it's an institution because it's a clump of social norms that defined how things operate.
Hmm. And so if we think about societies today or even other societies in the past, bands of hunter-gatherers, if I'm hearing you correctly, so institutions are these entities where these norms coalesce and they sort of like provide a rule set for how these norms should be followed and how to punish defectors or violators and things like this. Today, like, we often can point to, literally a building and say, that is our CDC building, and that is literally the institution where it's sort of formally housed. But I would imagine that historically the institutions were housed, so to speak, in things like rituals. So if you think of marriage as an institution, you didn't necessarily had to have a marriage building somewhere and someone inside of it, writing down what the marriage rules were, but there was this ritual that everyone participated in on a recurring basis in the culture.
Yeah, so the institution actually exists distributed across the minds of the people in the group.
Yeah.
I mean, there might be, for example, in if you're actually going through the ritual ceremony of marriage, it might be that the men know how to do one part of it and the women know how to do another part of it, and they don't know how to do the men don't know how to do the woman's part. But collectively we can do this. And then there's a set of standards for where we live after we get married. Do we live with the bride's family or the husband's family? And then what do the kids inherit? Do they inherit stuff from the father's side or the mother's side? So there's all these different rules that anthropologists have documented across societies. Now, if you want to get to the modern world, you have to think about another layer on top of that, which is the formal institution.
Hmm.
So at some point, people got together and said, hey, we have to formalize all this informal stuff we've been doing. So they began writing things down and
Hmm.
which solidifies it and has interesting effects in addition to the informal institution. But I'm really starting at a point like, forget about writing and all the kind of stuff of the modern world. We got to get there. So this is part of the process of getting there. And then what the kind of things you're thinking of are, okay, now let's write it all down and figure it out. One of the things I think we're learning in the modern world is that you can have all these written laws, but there's all kinds of informal stuff that's not written down
Yeah.
about what people can do and accept it. And then if some entrepreneurial politicians decide they're not going to follow those rules, then the institution can get pretty fragile because it hinges on both the unspoken norms and on the written laws, right?
Yeah, and I would imagine too. Perhaps we'll come to this towards the end when we talk about the present and the future. But despite even though today we have things like formal institutions and everything's codified into laws, you can literally go read things that are written down. Um, as institutions sort of grow and evolve and eventually start to break down in certain ways, if the formal institution starts to deviate from the actual traditions and rituals that the people that it's meant to govern are practicing, then these things can become misaligned over time.
Yep, you get these mismatches. Yep.
So I want to talk a little bit about religion here and its tie into ritual and social norms and things. You say towards the beginning that we evolved as a species to put faith in the accumulated wisdom of our forebears, and that this faith instinct is at the core of our species' success. My reading of that is that our ability to be cultural learners actually sort of baked in the types of psychological dispositions that naturally then gave rise to religious and supernatural beliefs.
Right. That's exactly right. And when I have another book called The Secret of Our Success, where I lay out these ideas more extensively. And the way I approach that is I show that in many human societies, there are complex procedures. So one I give an example of is throughout the tropics, people rely on eating something called cassava. It's also called manioc. And there are types of manioc which are high in cyanide. So you
Mm-hmm.
have to do a complex procedure to get all the cyanide out of it. Now, the individuals who do this haven't done experiments and they don't know which steps are involved or how long you're supposed to wait or how much water you're supposed to put in, but they're applying a formula that guarantees them that they don't have the cyanide in the cassava at the end. So, in order for that to evolve as a learner, you have to put faith in what you're learning from the previous generations and just do it the way they do it because that worked and that came down to you through this long cultural evolutionary process. So that's true for lots of tools and whatnot. In an era before science and the FDA and things like that. Uh, so that's the origins of this tendency. Some psychologists call it over-imitation, but you're putting faith in the wisdom of ancestors over, your own skepticism, your own experience. Sometimes you might feel like, well, it seems like maybe we should do it this way, but you're just going to follow the procedure because you don't know what those little steps could do. They could be crucial for these more complicated things to work out. And then the next step would be like, okay, what exists in the world? Are there ghosts? Are there gods? Does this ritual really bring me good hunting? I don't know. The ancestors have been doing it. Let's do the ritual and maybe we'll get better hunting out of it. That sort of thing.
Yeah. And that would explain why, there's so many things in different cultures around the world where something is like correct in a sense, like it matches up with the environment. Like, in the example you gave, they are correctly avoiding cyanide poisoning, even though they don't have microscopes and they don't know what cyanide is explicitly. There's any number of things you can think of here, sort of like one would be like the ayahuasca brew. People always like ask, oh, how on earth did people figure out how to do that? And I think you would probably say something like, well, it wasn't like one person figured it out. It probably evolved in a somewhat haphazard way through trial and error over time. And it was passed on because it worked to achieve some outcome. And then people simply just kept doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can show lots of good examples where you'll build up to a recipe for something that works really well, whereas, there's no single individual you can point to who came up with that. I mean, just a simple example from the more modern world, somewhat more modern, would be the light bulb. So people think Edison invented the light bulb, but in Britain, people think Joseph Swan invented it. Russians have another guy they think invented it. And it was actually, there were already 22 light bulbs patented before Edison showed up on the scene. So he was just tinkering with an existing technology, right?
Yeah.
But so who invented the light bulb? Actually, there's probably hundreds of guys who invented the light bulb, and Edison is just the one that we give the credit for. He also got rich on it, but
Yeah. That was the one that happened to gain widespread traction because he was tinkering with something that was already there in embryo, at least, or actually in a pretty mature form. The
yeah,
light
I mean, he
bulb.
saw a light bulb on in a Boston shop
Yeah.
as a young
Yeah.
man.
Interesting. So, the word meme has itself evolved in kind of funny ways over time. But if we go back to the Richard Dawkins selfish gene definition of meme, a meme is supposed to be the cultural analog of a gene. It's supposed to be sort of a unit of culture that can play into cultural evolution the same way that genes are sort of units of biological selection. Do you think that analogy holds? And if so, if memes are the cultural analog to genes and biology, what are norms and institutions analogous to?
So broadly, there is a sense in which genetic evolution and cultural evolution, they both share the transmission of information. I think where the meme concept went wrong is Dawkins and others later reasoned like, okay, so genes are discrete units that are highly preserved, so they have fecundity and longevity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's two of the key things that genes have. Now, culture can achieve many of those things, even if it doesn't have longevity and fecundity, and it's not a discrete trait. So it's easy to show how if you have a continuous trait, like say how long you make your arrow, that's just going to vary. It's a number of millimeters or something. Uh, but if you tend to copy people who are better hunters, the arrow is going to approach the optimal arrow length as long as people are making errors and the arrows are varying somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be able to approach the optimal length, but it's not discrete, right?
Right.
So there's a bunch of stuff that the meme idea imports that you don't really need, but it still has this procession of the flow of information through time and a filtering process. Um, Now, the other things like norms, a norm is actually a group level property
Mm-hmm.
because we have to have a sufficient frequency of people doing the behavior and a sufficient frequency of people who will judge those who don't do the behavior negatively, and that causes it to lock up. So it's a property, and it's kind of discrete in the sense that there is a point, at which these things lock up, but it's a group level property.
Mm-hmm. So, we can mostly take for granted in this discussion that humans obviously became different from other species and other apes at some point. We became these cultural learners, and culture started to really take over, and you get this sort of very interesting culture biology coevolution. But after we'd already become cultural learners, there are various points in history where major shifts happen that caused um, caused a lot of psychological change and gave a lot of sort of cultural feedback that then helped direct biological evolution. One of those areas, times in history that I want to talk about is the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to farming and sedentary societies. At a high level, sort of when and where did that start to happen, and what were sort of the major effects of that transition on the psychological traits that started to get selected for and against?
So that's a origins of food production is probably 10 to 12,000 years ago. You get the domestication of plants and animals. The earliest sites we have are in the Middle East, but then relatively soon after that, you also get some in China. And so this is going to put pressure on institutions because now you have a way of producing a lot of calories and potentially supporting larger populations. But in order to do that, you need institutions, you need to be able to defend territory. And so there's a bunch of downstream effects of this. And so there's this period of cultural evolution where agriculture is getting institutions that better fit it, that fit the local ecology. Groups are shifting their kinship system so as to defend territory. And when you grow up in a world with these different kinds of kinship systems, say based on clans instead of this sort of networky stuff that hunter-gatherers have, then you get a more of a parochial, in-group oriented kind of psychology. Now, this is not, there's no reason to think that is a genetic evolutionary process at this point. We know from contemporary data that this is shaping people's cultural psychology. You're growing up in a world with norms which are increasingly calling on you to put your clan first. Your welfare and your people taking care of you in your old age. It depends on this clan network that has emerged through this set of norms.
Mm-hmm. And at a high level, I would imagine just when you transition from a hunter-gatherer social structure to a farming structure, you have to plan around seasons. You've now got these food surpluses that you have to defend and store. So naturally, the group is going to have to be organized in a different way to handle how you're dealing with your food and defending it and things like this. And as you said, this can be an entirely cultural process. But I imagine too, when these sort of societies started to coalesce and stabilize, you're now in a different culture and environment, which is going to create different kinds of selection pressures that can feed back on what is or is not biologically advantageous. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I mean, off the top of my head, I know that David Reich and others have shown recently, and many others have over the years to different extents, that in fact the origins of agriculture are tied to a lot of really clear biological evolution and directional selection in humans.
Yeah, I mean, so in The Secret of Our Success, I talk about that quite a bit. I mean, the best documented cases are these shifts in like starch processing genes because you're relying a lot more on starch. That's something that still varies around the world today. Um, Lactose processing. So if you get the evolution of cows, for example, or camels, and dairying practices, then normally humans they lose their ability to produce milk, sometime after weaning, so in early childhood. But some populations, because of the presence of cows and milk, began to be able to process milk into adulthood. So this kind of throws a monkey wrench in the normal shutdown system for the production of the lactase enzyme, which breaks down the milk sugars. And whether a population has these seems to depend on it inventing or adopting dairying practices relatively early, but then not inventing cheese and yogurt processing, which is a sort of cultural evolutionary way to get to the same end.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yep.
yeah, so that's
Either
just an example. What's that?
biology and culture can allow you to extract calories from that type of food source.
That's right. So there's a couple different solutions. One's genetic, and so the genetic one happened in some populations because of the details of how cultural evolution unfolded. And Reich's new paper with Ali Akbar shows, using polygenic scores from the modern world, that it looks like there's been genetic selection on lots of different stuff among European populations in the last.
Yeah, and not just metabolism, but things like cognition, behavior, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I love that paper, but there's a lot of water yet to go under the bridge on that one because, I mean, it's tricky because you're using modern polygenic scores
Mhm.
based on things like the UK Biobank, and you're spotting alleles that predict educational attainment, for example. And then you're saying, what was going on with these allules 10,000 years ago? Well, we know they weren't predicting educational attainment 10,000 years ago
Right,
because there
right.
was no education to predict. So we got to figure out what they were doing and what was
Yeah.
favoring.
So we're making a presumption that because they make that prediction in today's world, they were somehow linked to what we might call cognition or intelligence or whatever back then. But it's really blurry exactly how you connect those dots, I would imagine.
Right. So there's lots more work to be done.
And another aspect of the transition into sedentary agricultural societies that I think is important and interesting is how this affected people's religious beliefs, the types of gods and the properties their gods had that they believed in. Can you give us a sense for what that transition was like, how religion itself and the types of deities and beliefs people have changed as they became sedentary farmers?
Right. So, I mean, the gods of many hunter-gatherer societies are often weak and whimsical, and they're moral in the same way people are moral, right? So they're morally flawed, they make mistakes, they get drunk, they give away secrets they shouldn't give away.
Hmm.
But over time, in order to bind these groups together, we've argued that I mean, the evidence is the gods got bigger and more powerful, better able to punish, the god of larger numbers of groups. So many gods in the past have been just tribal gods,
Mhm.
right? But then eventually we got gods of everybody. Of the whole world rather than just certain regions. And many people accepted that the Israelites have their God and the Canaanites have their God, and there's
Yeah.
all these different gods, and it's everybody believes all the gods exist. It's just that we have our guy. But gradually that changes over time. And one of our arguments is that particular supernatural beliefs and particular rituals that go along with those allow people to cooperate in larger groups, engage in economic relationships, keep the group together, things like that.
Mhm. And I would imagine a lot of this just has to do with the fact of how societies just scale up in terms of population size. If you're able to farm and build up food surpluses, that gives you the potential to support larger populations. But if you're going to do that, that's eventually going to necessitate people from different kinship groups coming together. And at that point, you need something to keep them together. And it can't be you have your God, I have my God, because that's what binds your individual kinship groups together. You need something like a universal, all seeing God that all of them sort of recognize as the essence of the culture at writ large.
Yeah. And in the book, I actually discuss one interesting case we have from New Guinea, where in New Guinea, like lots of places, clans have their own clan god. It's seen as like an ancestor that gave rise to the rest of the clan. People do rites and rituals and stuff to appease or to satiate the clan god. But then it's this case where they adopted this cult from this other group that was expanding. And that god was actually a clan god, but that when they adopted it, they didn't know that and they
Mm.
saw it as a god over the other gods. So they created a super
Mhm.
god.
So there's like
And
a
then
mutation in
he
the
was the god of
cultural.
all, it
Yeah.
was a mutation. It
Yeah.
was a god of all these clans. And then that seemed to, that along with some ritual stuff allowed the group to cooperate more. So it's an actual case where you can see the god expand and
Yeah.
then make the group stronger.
Yeah. And tying that back to what we were talking about earlier about how cultural evolution actually proceeds, no one engineered that change. It was just sort of a mistake that popped up and it happened to work for that group, which enabled them to survive at the expense of other groups, I would imagine.
Right, right. And lots of cases in history of groups saying, those guys are so successful, they must have powerful gods. We should learn more about their god and,
Mm-hmm.
try and take
Yeah.
them on.
So, in some sense, the gods are sort of a way people talk about the actual cultural evolutionary dynamics governing their groups that they don't actually have an explicit sort of theory and understanding of. But nonetheless, people come up with religious beliefs and language systems so that those are sort of pointing to the same thing. When people talk about their gods, in some sense, I think they're actually talking about the cultural evolutionary process itself.
Right, someone in the background, right?
And so eventually we get so religion changes, you start having these universal gods. This is changing and it's bound up with how people relate to each other, both their kin, people closely genetically related to them, people more distantly genetically related to them, and then even eventually people who are even more distantly related. How did from the dawn of agriculture to sort of the start and the progression of Western sort of Christian cultures in Europe, how did people's relationship with kin and with strangers start to change?
Well, broadly, the overall process is that there's a bunch of different sort of social technologies that are evolving and spreading around that are allowing people to engage with strangers. So, for example, in the Mediterranean world, one of the ways in which gods would help this process is a little bit sort of, it's not a very Christian approach, but we would go to a god and that there would be a big trading market, and then nearby there would be altars and stuff you could go to. So you'd go with a guy who you want to trade oil for olives. Well, I guess that wouldn't make sense. Oil for olives for steel.
Hmm.
And, you're from different parts and you got to make this deal and you could both profit from it if you can do it, but you got to trust the guy. So you would both swear on a god that you shared in common, and you
Mm.
swear an oath to the god. That's a big deal because people took oaths and honor very seriously. So if you were to break that oath, there's a chance the god's going to zap you. So it was a way of using this honor psychology to allow long distance trade to occur.
Hmm. And it's not like there's a date and a city we can point to here, but at some point after sedentary agriculture starts, you eventually get what you call weird cultures or weird societies, what some people call Western culture. Roughly, when and where did this start to happen? It's, at some point, we talk about European history, and if you go back far enough, you get the origins of agriculture. Somewhere in between, these sort of weird societies must have emerged. Is there an approximate sort of first weird culture that you can point to?
Well, so I have an origin story, which is that the main thing that would have driven parts of Europe to be increasingly weird is the spread of a set of beliefs about the family and marriage systems that begins in late antiquity with the diffusion of Christianity. So the Western Church, which eventually evolves into what we think of as the Roman Catholic Church,
Mhm.
adopts in 300, 400, 500, that time period, a set of policies about marriage that prevents people from marrying their cousins, for example, and begins to change the inheritance system so that individuals can pass on to their kids without all of their kinfolk jumping in on it. Um, Neolocal residence, which means the husband and wife live separately from the family, which weakens kin connections. A bunch of things that weaken kin connections, and eventually, over 500 years or so, break many of the populations in many parts of Europe down into monogamous nuclear families. And these are quite different kinship structures than we find throughout Europe and that anthropologists have documented around the world. And then in the ashes of the destruction of all these different kin groups, you begin to see the rise of impersonal institutions, where groups of strangers get together. And so by 1000 CE, you have the rise of monasteries that aren't based on lineages. So there are monasteries before that, but they're family based and
Mhm.
lineage based. Things like groups like the Cistercians. And you get the beginning of universities, which are either kind of unions of students or unions of professors. Eventually, those meet up. And you also get self-help groups where people will join because you don't have family to support you. So if you get injured, there's nobody to take care of you in old age. Or, I mean, there's nobody to take care of you in old age or if you get injured. And eventually you get charter towns. And so these are towns that are sort of voluntary organizations that you can join and you become a citizen, you get certain rights and privileges, but you also have obligations. And this ends up serving some of the functions that the territorial localized clan, for example, would have taken in a former time.
Mhm. So many of us take this for granted as weird people, like myself, right? We're in one of these societies, these weird cultures. So my whole life, it's just been, a cultural fact of my existence that, well, yeah, you don't marry or think romantically about your cousins or near relatives. And we have sort of like these norms and institutions around marriage and who is an acceptable partner and things like that. What your book really pointed out was not only is that weird historically, but that's still fairly weird on a global scale today. It's for most of human history, most cultures would have considered it perfectly normal and okay to marry a cousin, for example.
Yeah, that's right. And so lots of anthropologists have documented cross cousin marriage is very popular. So it's interesting because there's cross and parallel cousins. And cross cousins are your father's sister's children and your mother's brother's children. And
Mm.
those are marriage partners, right? But your father's brother's children and your mother's sister's children are considered siblings. So it gives you both an expanded sibling circle and particular marriage partners. You can do the same thing out with second cousins and third cousins and whatnot.
Mhm.
So
And so these changing norms around marriage, around mating, what did that happen? What were the features of Christianity that led to that? Why did these sorts of changes happen in the Christian world, but didn't happen as much in other cultures?
yeah, and there's actually you got to think of it in a few layers.
Hmm.
One is it's really Latin Christendom that adopts these. So the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, has some of them, but they tend to be implemented later and not with as much enthusiasm as the Western Church gets into it. So that's a difference. And then other kinds of Christianity. So some of the oldest brands of Christianity, Syriac Christianity, Coptic Christianity, they kept marrying their cousins for another millennium.
Hmm.
So it's not really a Christian thing. It's sort of part of
I see.
Christian.
It's a subset of the Christians. One subset of the Christians did that, and they're still with us today. Another subset did it more weakly, and we call that, I guess, the Eastern Orthodox
Yeah.
branch. And then other subsets didn't do that, but they died out, and we don't really even talk about
Yeah,
them.
or they're small. I
They're
mean,
small.
they mostly persist in small groups, at least compared to Latin Christianity.
Hmm.
So, and the bigger picture though is if you kind of zoom out from Christianity, there's all these different religions in the
Hmm.
sort of larger Mediterranean, Middle Eastern world, and they're doing different things with the family. So if you look at Islam, which comes along a bit later, but it curbs polygyny, which Christianity curbs polygyny massively down to just one spouse. Uh, Islam curbs it down to just four, but you have to treat them equally. Parallel cousin marriage pops up, so many Muslims marry their father's brother's kid, and so they're playing around with marriage in the family. Over in Zoroastrianism in Persia, actually cousin marriage is preferred.
Hmm.
There, it's a religiously good thing to marry a close cousin, and even at the level of the royalty, sometimes they would have brother-sister marriage because that was seen as a good thing.
Hmm.
So just the important point is lots of variation. People don't really, there's no way to reason through these things and figure it out ahead of time.
Yeah.
But it so happens one group got a combination that led to this change in social structure and is part of the story of the rise of the West.
Hmm. But this also the way that this cultural process happens gives rise to diversities across groups in terms of their norms around marriage and things like that. But that makes it, that diversity makes it very clear that there's then going to be clear feedback on the biology side of this, because I would imagine that your taboos that you have or don't have around cousin marriages will have ramifications for, say, genetic diversity or inbreeding issues moving forward.
Yeah. Cousin marriage, as long as it's not too common, you can detect the effects on the sort of negative inbreeding effects, but you need pretty large populations and pretty large sample sizes. And there is a countervailing factor that people often forget, which is that it actually increases your genetic relatedness in a network. So, for example, if you look at Iceland and you just look at fitness, right? You just count babies, right? Count descendants. It turns out the optimal marriage was second cousins
Hmm.
because you're not very related, so you're not going to get very much inbreeding depression, but you still are creating a large network of relatives for support, social aid, and all the kind of social side of things. Um,
Mhm.
so
So
people often think that part of this story is an inbreeding story. I think the inbreeding story is a weaker end of what's going on.
I see. So there's probably, strictly speaking, from a strict sort of Darwinian reproductive success standpoint, there's probably some intermediate level that's most beneficial in terms of how closely or distantly
Yeah,
related you are to whoever you mate with.
right.
Interesting. How so what were some of the key changes here that we're talking about or that we haven't talked about yet, that I think a lot of what we're talking about, what you point to in the book, is you have these cultural changes that happen in terms of how people think about family structure, how people think about family planning, how they relate to those in their society, that enable society to really scale up in certain ways. How do we tie some of those dots together? So one thing you could mention here, I think, is probably like the monogamy polygyny thing. Why isn't it that more polygynous societies, why can't they scale up to the extent or in the ways that, say, more monogamous societies can?
Right. So the polygyny is a specific, so there's the sort of general kinship story, and I spend extra time on the monogamy polygyny thing because something unique is happening there. That's not just about the tightness of family bonds and the openness to strangers and the willingness to engage in institutions that involve impersonal interactions, but that if you have polygynous marriage and if you have any degree of wealth in the society, your elite and high status males are going to accumulate a lot of wives, and we see this, around the world across continents when you look back into history. And so that's going to always create a large pool of low status unmarried men who are going to have to take great risks in order to get a chance to get into the marriage and mating market. And this leads to raiding, violence in the modern world, leads to substance abuse. So it's just harder to run a society. And you should also think about as enlisting fewer men in the father role. So there's just, you're going to have men that have a lot of children. It's hard to do very much parenting there. And then guys who have no children at the other end, and they're sort of never going to become fathers because they're going to be evolutionary zeros.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like, that's almost the default state of humans, and it requires some innovations around social norms and institutions to constrain that tendency in ways that enable larger scale societies to build up, where you don't just have this large pool of disaffected people.
That's right. So 85% of societies in the anthropological record allowed high status men to take additional wives. In contrast, very few societies.
Full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomes, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode.